Cleveland didn't throw SHEDEUR Sanders into the spotlight. They built around him, quietly and deliberately. Jimmy Haslam saw the potential not just for touchdowns but for transformation. While other franchises chased short-term wins, Haslam played the long game, shaping Sanders into a strategic asset whose brand now rivals his on-field promise. This isn't about waiting for results, it's about designing them. With global markets engaged and fan loyalty deepening, Cleveland's approach is paying off in ways traditional models can't replicate. This isn't just a franchise move, it's a market shift. By nurturing Sanders' cultural resonance and long-term brand appeal, the Browns are redefining what a cornerstone player looks like. His financial independence through equity stakes, his media dominance, and his worldwide fan base have turned him into a billion-dollar entity still early in his career. Cleveland's restraint wasn't caution, it was precision. And now, with Sanders leading a new generation of athlete entrepreneurs, the franchise isn't just winning the future, it's rewriting the. SHEDEUR Sanders didn't just enter the NFL with hype, he arrived with a business model. Rookie players usually get measured by draft position, combined stats, or preseason flashes. But SHEDEUR was measured by revenue. Endorsement revenue.
If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed.
Jersey sales. International buzz. He walked into a league where most rookies pray to make an impact, and instead he shifted the power dynamic between owners and players. His jersey was already on the backs of fans in countries that didn't even broadcast NFL games regularly. There were SHEDEUR sightings in London, Lagos, Dubai, Tokyo. Cities where the local teams didn't matter nearly as much as the personality behind the number. This wasn't just a breakout rookie moment. It was a global rollout, and SHEDEUR was and that product came with equity. Literally. His deal wasn't just about getting paid to perform, it was about earning on every dollar of attention. Sanders had a prime equity clause that meant when people bought, clicked, or shared his name, he got a piece of it. It wasn't hype for hype's sake. It was leverage turned into liquidity. He had multiple 300-yard games to validate the buzz, yes. But what set him apart was the way his name moved merchandise and metrics, not just chains. He played efficiently even under pressure, but his real edge was that he understood something most rookies don't. Value in the NFL isn't just on the field anymore. It's in the feet. That's where Jimmy Haslam stepped in. While other team owners were still treating players like assets on a spreadsheet, Haslam saw a brand. He didn't draft a quarterback, he invested in a cultural phenomenon. And then he got to work building the infrastructure around it. Haslam made it clear that SHEDEUR wouldn't be rushed. This wasn't about throwing him to the wolves for short-term wins. It was about protecting the investment, building the fan base, and letting the brand compound. Development wasn't just about quarterback reads, it was about global positioning. This wasn't Cleveland playing catch-up. This was Cleveland becoming the blueprint. Haslam's front office understood that long-term player value had shifted. It wasn't defined by stats alone, it was now based on cultural relevance, audience loyalty, and the power to drive revenue across verticals. The league noticed. Other franchises raised eyebrows. Whispers turned into complaints. Owners uncomfortable with the shift started to realize they weren't just competing with each other, they were competing with players who now had more brand equity than their. Haslam didn't blink. While others tried to contain the momentum, he leaned into it. Behind the scenes, the Browns' ownership was already setting up the future. Global campaigns, strategic licensing, cross-industry collaborations. All with SHEDEUR at the center. This wasn't marketing fluff. It was financial strategy. SHEDEUR wasn't just a quarterback, he was an asset class. And Haslam, having watched the economics of sports evolve over the past decade, moved decisively to make Cleveland the home of a new kind of football. The numbers backed it up. Early projections on SHEDEUR's merchandise were shattered before mid-season. His sponsorship deals pulled more engagement than many veteran stars. This wasn't potential. This was realized value, and it was happening in real time. Haslam's willingness to embrace the change put pressure on the league's old guard. NFL power traditionally lived in contracts, TV rights, and tight commissioner control. But SHEDEUR's model slipped through those fingers. His value didn't come from the league, it came from his audience. And that made him harder to contain. Collection. Even during games, it became obvious how different this era was. Opponents weren't just lining up against a quarterback, they were facing a walking media ecosystem. The cameras didn't just follow the game, they followed the story. SHEDEUR's highlights were already packaged and viral before the final whistle. Cleveland leaned into it. Instead of pushing for fast results on the field, they built the narrative around legacy. Fans weren't just cheering for wins, they were buying into a journey. The slow rollout was deliberate. Every step was part of a bigger branding move that turned attention into fandom, and fandom into revenue collection. What made it so disruptive was that it worked. International fan engagement grew. Non-traditional football markets started paying attention to Browns games. Kids in South Korea knew the name SHEDEUR before they knew the rules of the game. It wasn't about touchdowns. It was about touchpoints. Haslam and his team created a scenario where Sanders didn't need to be a Hall of Famer to be historically important. His cultural relevance made the traditional path obsolete. They didn't need to win the Super Bowl next season, they needed to keep him healthy, visible, and emotionally resonant. And they nailed it. This new Cleveland model didn't just challenge old valuation systems, it exposed them. Draft rankings suddenly looked outdated. Rookie contracts seemed laughably low for someone pulling in millions from branding alone. Sanders' trajectory proved that attention is now its own form of equity, and the Browns held majority shares. Other teams scrambled. Some tried to replicate it. Others tried to dismiss it. But no one could ignore it. The balance of power was shifting, and it was happening in a city that hadn't traditionally led the cultural conversation in football. Now, Cleveland was ground zero for the NFL's brand revolution. The league's discomfort grew louder. Not just because Sanders was successful, but because he didn't need the league's approval to be valuable. That kind of independence was unsettling. Owners who had grown comfortable with control were watching a new model take shape, one where players could generate influence outside the league's ecosystem. SHEDEUR Sanders didn't just change what a rookie could be. He changed what a football player could mean. His value wasn't theoretical, it was transactional. Measurable in real-time data, global reach, and fan connection. The Browns didn't just draft a quarterback. They acquired a... SHEDEUR's presence wasn't limited to the game clock. He was on every timeline, every trending list, every post-game recap, whether he threw 2 touchdowns or sat out a quarter. The media didn't just cover him, they revolved around him. ESPN, Bleacher Report, even international outlets weren't waiting for results. They were reacting to the aura. This wasn't just buzz. It was calculated cultural capital. Sanders' face was on billboards before some rookies had signed contracts. His voice was on podcasts, his clips dominated TikTok, and his brand partnerships were already setting new league expectations. The kid wasn't just playing the game, he was redesigning the playbook for athletes. It made sense that someone like Jimmy Haslam would get it. While others saw Sanders as a media darling, Haslam saw asset diversification. Every endorsement was more than exposure, it was data. It was proof that SHEDEUR could drive interest and conversion at a level the NFL wasn't used to seeing in a rookie. Sanders wasn't just taking interviews, he was commanding space. His charisma translated to camera, his name sold product, and most importantly, his following was loyal. Not regional. Not team-based. Loyal to him. And that kind of fan base? It's not bought, it's built. Haslam knew that was worth more than a first-round pick. Behind closed doors, owners started asking questions. Not about Sanders' mechanics or reads, but about revenue splits and media clauses. The kind of questions that usually come up when someone breaks the model. Because what SHEDEUR represented wasn't just a player who could score, it was a player who didn't need the league's machine to matter. Haslam wasn't asking for permission. He built the machine around Sanders and told the NFL to catch up. The Browns front office had already positioned itself as a media-savvy business hub, prepared to monetize Sanders' image beyond Sunday. Commercials, docuseries, overseas licensing deals, they were all in motion. This wasn't noise, it was infrastructure. While critics tried to frame it as distraction, Haslam understood that the real distraction was pretending players were only valuable between kickoff and final whistle. The franchise wasn't just protecting a quarterback. It was protecting a portfolio. And that portfolio was outperforming projections. In merchandise, in brand engagement, and in global reach. Haslam's Browns were proving that being first to understand new value models is more important than following the old rules. Especially when the league is slow to... There was a reason traditionalists felt uneasy. Sanders didn't owe his fame to league coverage or PR pushes. He wasn't created by the NFL machine, he brought his own spotlight. That independence is what made the league nervous. Because once players realize their value exists outside the team structure, it shifts everything. Haslam leaned into that discomfort. His team helped Sanders negotiate endorsement terms that reflected global visibility. They set up merchandise pipelines that allowed international shipping, and partnered with platforms that weren't traditionally NFL affiliates. The message was clear: If the NFL didn't want to modernize, Cleveland would. And for Sanders, it was working. He wasn't a sideshow to football, he was proof that attention is currency. The Browns turned their rookie into a revenue engine, and they did it without compromising his development. No overexposure. No rushed starts. Just a clear path to long-term brand dominance. The Browns knew what they had, a player whose cultural footprint grew even when he wasn't on the field. And they weren't about to waste it on short-term headlines. Their focus was asset maturity, making sure SHEDEUR reached peak value right when the franchise needed him most. Collection. This approach wasn't about slow play, it was about smart play. By managing his visibility, the Browns kept demand high. By limiting overexposure, they created scarcity. And in a world driven by hype cycles, scarcity is power. Every time Sanders did speak, every time he did play, it meant something. That's why fans didn't lose interest, they became more invested. They weren't just following a player's stats. They were following his rise, his evolution, his growing influence. It became a season-long narrative arc that felt bigger than the other teams didn't know how to respond. Some tried to replicate the playbook. But without the timing, the infrastructure, or the right player, it fell flat. Because SHEDEUR wasn't just famous, he was resonant. He mattered to people. That's why he sold jerseys in places that had never heard of the Browns before. Why his post-game comments got more clicks than the game recaps. Why his brand equity kept climbing, even during weeks he wasn't in the spotlight. The man was a franchise within the franchise. For the Browns, it wasn't just about winning games. It was about redefining success. A single player's cultural value was now a metric. Something to build strategy around. Haslam's investment in Sanders had already changed how the team approached everything, from stadium naming rights to media partnerships. Cleveland wasn't trying to just play in the NFL. They were trying to outgrow it. Become the first franchise that didn't just house talent but grew it like a tech company grows intellectual property. And that concept, treating an athlete like a startup, was years ahead of where the league was. And SHEDEUR? He was just getting started. With every move, he exposed how behind the league had been in acknowledging player-led economies. He wasn't a disruptor by design, he was just doing what made sense in 2026. And that was the real shakeup. The NFL was being pulled into the modern era, not by committees or strategy sessions, but by one rookie and one owner who saw the writing on the wall. Sanders' rise wasn't just about him. It was a wake-up call for a league built on control now facing a generation built on autonomy. The league couldn't ignore it anymore. Teams that had passed on Sanders weren't just regretting the player, they were regretting the market share. One by one, analysts started shifting the conversation. He wasn't just a promising rookie anymore. He was a case study. A signal that the blueprint had officially changed. The balance of power wasn't just nudging toward players. It was already there. Sanders wasn't calling plays in the huddle yet, but off the field? He was directing traffic. Every public move he made had ripple effects, shaping endorsement trends, media behavior, and even how scouts started ranking quarterback. What do you do when the rookie controls more narrative than the league's top-paid veterans? The NFL, for all its control mechanisms, couldn't spin this into a fluke. Not when his metrics outperformed theirs. Not when his jersey kept outselling theirs. Not when the audience made it clear who they were watching for. The public wasn't debating whether SHEDEUR Sanders had potential. They were following him like a public company. Uptrends, volatility, growth. Every press appearance was an earnings call. Every Instagram post was a brand expansion. And all of it came from one thing: leverage. That leverage didn't exist in a vacuum. Jimmy Haslam knew the NFL wouldn't hand over control quietly. But he also knew it didn't have to. Because what Sanders represented wasn't rebellion, it was evolution. A smarter league would adapt. A slower league would resist. And Haslam was betting on being ahead of both. He brought in new consultants. Not just football minds, but brand strategists, digital economists, global marketers. The team's structure evolved from front office and coaching staff to entertainment business with a football division. That's what it took to support someone like Sanders. And the results kept stacking. You couldn't walk into a retail store without seeing a number 2 Browns jersey next to national sports icons. But it wasn't just merch. It was the emotional gravity he carried. He gave Cleveland something it hadn't had in years: aspiration. The city, the fan base, the stadium, they weren't rallying around a potential playoff run. They were rallying around a new identity. One that said they weren't just here to compete, they were here to change the industry. And it all hinged on the guy whose arrival everyone had initially dismissed as hype. You could see the shift in press conferences. Media no longer treated Sanders as just another player learning the ropes. He was being asked questions usually reserved for franchise owners. About impact. About vision. About the direction of the sport. And he handled it like he'd been doing it for years. Haslam made sure the infrastructure around him reflected that tone. From tailored media training to curated brand collaborations, everything was managed to scale. Not just protect. Scale. The Browns weren't hiding him from the spotlight, they were building a bigger. There was a confidence now. Not just in Sanders but in the ownership that backed him. Other executives began admitting, anonymously of course, that they'd miscalculated. They'd treated visibility as a liability. The Browns treated it as an asset. Haslam wasn't trying to copy anyone's model. He was done chasing what other franchises had. He'd built something different, something ahead. While the league held tight to old systems, Haslam had pivoted to the future. A franchise that didn't just react to trends but authored them. Collection. Even the way the Browns played started to reflect the change. Games weren't just contests, they were content. Strategically managed for visibility, impact and long-term story arcs. Whether Sanders was starting or observing, he was always central to the plot. There was no more pretending that on-field performance was the only metric. Not when SHEDEUR's influence on fan engagement outpaced the scoreboard. Every appearance, every sideline shot, every post-game quote became part of the brand journey, and fans ate it up. Collection. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about clarity. The Browns had finally figured out that football teams weren't just sports franchises anymore, they were media properties. And SHEDEUR Sanders was their flagship product. The league didn't like the optics but they couldn't deny the results. While other teams scraped for attention, Cleveland was the headline. While others negotiated with sponsors, SHEDEUR was already building partnerships. And all while delivering credible performance when it mattered. Traditionalists hated it. They called it a distraction. They warned about ego and culture and what happens when it stops working. But it wasn't stopping. If anything, it was accelerating. The more they pushed back, the more obvious it became that the old model was scared. Because the new model wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was Sanders in real time changing the economic structure of the league. Haslam didn't just draft a player, he rewrote the terms. And now every team had to choose, adapt or fall behind. The shift was irreversible. Players took note. Agents took note. Even high school athletes started branding earlier, thinking longer term. Because the Sanders blueprint was working. And it wasn't locked behind league approval. It was out in the open. What Jimmy Haslam and SHEDEUR Sanders had done wasn't just good business, it was a line in the sand. The league had built itself on control, exclusivity, hierarchy. But now, the biggest value driver in the sport was a 20-something-year-old who didn't ask for permission to. SHEDEUR wasn't looking to fit into the mold. He was reshaping it. The NFL had decades of precedent for how rookies were supposed to behave, how they were supposed to earn their place, build quietly, stay humble, stay grateful. But SHEDEUR brought receipts. Real influence. Real attention. Real money. And when he walked into the building, he didn't just carry himself like a player. He moved like an enterprise. Not because he was trying to make a point, but because he didn't need to ask anyone for validation. His presence was already a signal that the era had shifted. Jimmy Haslam saw it coming. He didn't try to tame it. He amplified it. While the rest of the league debated whether it was too soon, too flashy, or too dangerous, Haslam doubled down. He gave Sanders the room to grow and the tools to scale. That's the part people still don't understand. This wasn't just a gamble on talent. It was a full-on strategy shift. Haslam knew what everyone else would eventually figure out. The real currency wasn't touchdowns, it was attention. And SHEDEUR had a monopoly on it. Cleveland wasn't just in the game. Cleveland was the fans? They felt it. Not in some abstract marketing deck kind of way, but in their wallets, their feeds, their conversations. SHEDEUR gave them something that had been missing for years. A reason to believe. And it wasn't just about winning. It was about being part of something historic. Cleveland had seen stars before. They cheered through false starts and rebuilds. But this was different. This wasn't a guy trying to escape the city's legacy. This was someone rewriting it. And they could feel that in every headline, every sold-out jersey, every mention on the national stage. The NFL isn't going back after this. Not now. Not with this many eyes on the playbook. The model that SHEDEUR Sanders and Jimmy Haslam executed so smoothly, it's the new standard. Maybe not every team can pull it off. Maybe not every player is built for it. But the blueprint exists now. And that's the part that rattles the system the most. This wasn't hype. It wasn't viral noise. It was a warning shot. The league has officially entered an era where cultural weight means just as much, if not more, than draft position or combined stats. And one franchise saw it early, moved fast, and took control. Sanders isn't just an athlete. He's a mirror. And every owner, GM, and player staring into it now has a decision to make. Adapt or fade. If you've been following this rise, if you've felt the shift, and if you're just as fascinated by the way sports and business are colliding in real time, don't just scroll past. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you think the league's old model is officially outdated. Subscribe for more breakdowns like this because trust me, we're only getting started.